In this section of the recording, I'm going to be talking about effective communication skills. And although you'll need to become an effective listener if you want to be a useful psychological first aider, effective communication can be beneficial in any interpersonal relationship and therefore has many uses. Before I start talking about effective communication skills, I'm going to start by briefly mentioning the importance of listening. And to do this, I've used the Chinese character of the verb which means to listen, because it gives you some idea of how important this skill really is. There's a section on the left which denotes the ear, and then there are 4 other sections to the right. The top one says you, beneath that come the eyes, next is undivided attention, and at the bottom is the heart. And I think that really shows all the components of active listening and shows how important it is when you're using that skill. But also, developing more effective ways of talking and communicating with each other can help reduce stress levels and lay the foundation for effective and efficient problem solving. We talk generally on a daily basis, face to face with people. We listen when being talked to. We write reports and letters, emails, we read documents, we text, converse on the telephone and by fax. We use sign language and body language, and yet despite the myriad of communication methods available to us, all too often the meanings we think we are conveying are misunderstood. Communication is at least a two-way process, and it involves at least 2 people, a sender and a receiver. And for communication to be successful, I suppose the receiver must understand the message in the way that the sender intended. Much like this recording, I'm talking to you, and I'm hoping that what I'm sending out to you is understood, and because there's no opportunity for immediate feedback, I won't know that. But what I will say to you, we welcome any feedback, any comments about the recordings that we've prepared in this educational suite on how to become a psychological first aider. So how do we become an effective communicator? Misunderstanding and confusion often occur and can cause enormous problems. If you think that the information you've conveyed has been understood, but you haven't checked it out with the person on the other end who's receiving it, it won't be long before difficulties start to emerge. I've got an example here. I mean, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it does give you some idea how words can get very mixed up. Just want to imagine that walking along the seafront are 2 friends, and they're busy in conversation. And this is how the communication goes. First speaker says, "Isn't it windy?" Second speaker says, "No, it's Thursday." "So am I," says the first speaker. "Let's have a drink." So as I say, that's really exaggerated, but it doesn't take long for the actual conversation to become mixed up. So windy is misunderstood for Wednesday, and Thursday misunderstood for Thirsty. And before you know where you are, these 2 friends are sitting in a cafe having a drink, and when in fact the first speaker only said, "Isn't it windy?" If you want to become an effective communicator, you need to learn to be effective at all points in the communication process, and you need to be comfortable with the different channels of communication. I'm going to look at the communication process next. Whenever you communicate with another person, you're communicating following specific steps, the communication process. And the person who is the communication originator determines the content of the message and transmits it through a channel, encoding. Whilst the person receiving the message unravels its content, decoding, as they believe it to be, and then feeds back their understanding and or misunderstanding, if we think of the previous example, of the message to the originator. So it's important to understand the steps of communication. So by understanding what's going on in the process, for example, the different steps, you can become much more aware of your role in the communication itself. This means you will be helped to recognize what you need to do and or change to become an effective communicator. So it's important to plan your message. Don't just rush in before you strike up a communication. Take a breath and think about what you want to say and why you want to say it. There's no point in communicating unnecessary information. You'll be wasting your time and that of the receiver. All too often, people don't know when to stop talking and or writing because they believe if they keep at it, all points will be covered. How many people do you know that actually talk a lot but don't say anything? And there's no point in communicating unnecessary information because you'll be wasting your time and the time of the person on the receiving end of the communication. And very often that can cause additional confusion. So you need to understand the reason for your communication. Understand the audience and who you're talking to. Plan what you want to say and what communication methods you'll use. And if you can, seek feedback from that person. For example, what and how was the message received? Many people, at the end of what they're saying, does that make sense? Do you understand? Particularly in teaching environments. So it's very important to check out if the message you're sending has been understood, how you intended it to be understood in the first place. When you start thinking about your message in more detail and the communication process, you'll become much better at putting together a clear communication channel which will be understood. And if you're in a psychological first aid position, that's exactly what you want to happen. Because if someone is very, very distressed, it's unlikely that they'll actually be listening in any particular detail to what you're saying because they'll be so upset. When you know what you want to say, the next thing to do is to decide on exactly how you'll say it. After all, it's your message, and therefore you take responsibility for sending clear and concise information. Therefore, in order to achieve this, you need to think about not only what you will say, but also how the receiver will perceive your message. We often focus on the message, what we want to say and the method we'll use, but completely forget the receiver. If we do not consider the other person's perspective, it's likely that part and or our entire message will be lost. To communicate effectively, it's important to consider these points. Understand what you really want to say. Attempt to anticipate potential responses and or reactions to your message. Choose words and or body language, if communicating face-to-face, that enables the other person to really hear what you are saying. Let's think about written communication. With written communication, make sure what you write will be perceived in the way you intended. Remember, words on a page don't have emotions. They don't smile or frown at you. But they do have the power to cause distress and or pleasure. We only have to read some of the greatest literary works to know the emotional content of the written word. It's very powerful. So always reread your communication before sending, and take your time too. Review what you've written. Avoid slang and or jargon. Check grammar. Check the attitude, the tone, and or nuances. Now's the time to make changes if you think your message will be misunderstood. Too late when it's sent. And think about the cultural context. Whether speaking or writing your message, it's important to consider the cultural context. Therefore, if you think there's potential for misunderstanding due to cultural barriers, make sure you've checked out and made good any issues in advance. And if you don't know, you're not sure whether it may cause offence or it's not quite the right way of doing it, why not consult someone that knows? Discuss potential problems of communication with people who have got more knowledge on the subject than you have. Engage in some research and develop your awareness on difference. And if you don't know, ask the question. Much better to find out before you send the message. Choose the best communication channel for your message. The choices are endless, but it's important you choose the best communication method you want to be effective, efficient, and make the most of the opportunity you have. Generally speaking, if you are going to be offering psychological first aid, it's probably going to be in a face-to-face, immediate situation. So, although on this recording I've spoken about other methods of communication, you're more than likely, in terms of psychological first aid, be in a face-to-face situation. However, learning about other communication skills can help you in your own personal areas of your own life, so it's worth talking about them and mentioning them. So when you determine the best way to send a message, it's important to think about the emotional content and the sensitivity of the message. Can you communicate the details in your chosen method? Preferences for the receiver. Think about the time you have. Will you need to ask and answer further questions? And what are the circumstances and the requirements? And of course, if you're going to be an effective communicator, I said at the beginning of this recording that it was important to learn to listen as well. It's often much easier to focus on your speaking because you want to get your point across, and you often have lots that you want to say. However, the beauty of a good communicator is the ability to step back and invite the other person to speak and just listen to what they've got to say without thinking what you want to say next. So it's about adopting a mindful listening stance. You won't be adopting a passive stance if you listen to the other person, because active listening is hard work, and it means you'll be giving your undivided attention to the speaker. Remember the characters of the Chinese verb to listen in the opening lines of this recording? If not, go back and listen again. I think you'll realise how important that character really is. Well, I've come to the end of part 1 of effective communication skills, but there is a part 2. So in this recording, I'd like to thank you for listening and good luck with becoming an effective communicator.